We're going to pick up with discussing Hitler and his actions that led to the outbreak of World War II in 1939. We left off last recording with this screen right here, and these were the different steps that Hitler was taking to revise or pretty much eliminate the Treaty of Versailles for the country of Germany. We had mentioned that they announced they weren't going to continue their reparations payments. They withdrew themselves from the League of Nations. They began massive rearmament. They tried to appear that they were friendly nature by Hitler signing this non-aggression pact with Poland. Hitler then tried to annex Austria in an attempted Anschluss, which failed in the first attempt, but later on succeeded. Another success for Hitler was the idea of the Saar, which was an area that was supposed to be under League control with the Treaty of Versailles and have an independent vote. However, the vote that took place showed that the people wanted to reunite with Germany, and Hitler used this greatly to his advantage for propaganda. Finally, Hitler announced that there would be compulsory military service and revealed the existence of an air force within Germany. And at that point, the army stood at 500,000 men. So let's look at how the European countries responded to all these actions that Hitler took to eliminate the Treaty of Versailles for Germany. Particularly Britain, France, and Italy were most concerned, as they had the most reason to fear what was happening with German expansion. They formed something called the Strasse Front, which you can see mentioned on page 116. And basically this Strasse Front was the idea that these three powers would come to an agreement to stop Hitler, or at least put up a resistance to what Hitler was doing. However, there was no clear details about how that was going to be achieved, and so therefore nothing was really set in stone. It was kind of similar to when we looked at the Covenant of the League of Nations, how there were a lot of things mentioned in the Covenant and what they wanted to do, but it didn't really spell out how it was going to be done. And if that's the case, then you have no clear plan of action to take, in this case, stopping Hitler. Because this Strasse Front was sort of weak and poorly worded, it was shown to be meaningless by a couple different things. First of all, shortly after the Strasse Front was signed, Britain and Germany signed a separate agreement, a naval agreement, called the Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935. And you can see this mentioned on 116 as well. Basically, what this agreement allowed was for Germany to have a larger military than what was allowed by the Treaty of Versailles. Britain did this acting in their own self-interest, and that ties back to the last chapter, how we said that from the late 20s on into the 30s, countries were more acting to try to secure their own issues because of issues like the Great Depression. So they were more concerned with their own problems back home. And this is definitely evidence of that. It kind of showed that these countries were caving into Hitler and that his aggression was succeeding in intimidating countries. Because of the fact that this agreement was signed between Britain and Germany, Hitler saw this as more of a green light to continue with what he was trying to do. It was a passive victory, is how your book describes it, because Britain pretty much accepted that Germany was rearming, which according to the Treaty of Versailles, they were strictly forbidden to. Hitler then expanded on this when the Abyssinian crisis hit, because in that situation, like we've already talked about in the last chapter, Italy, Britain, and France had a breakdown of discussions because Italy wanted to take over Abyssinia. Britain and France tried to resolve the situation outside the League. It blew up in all of their faces. Italy left the League because they were embarrassed by the situation when Britain and France tried to double back on what they had told Italy to begin with. And so Italy left the League, and from this point on, Hitler was pretty much given free rein to continue his expansionist plans. And now that he had successfully started rearming Germany, he could pretty much do whatever he wanted to at this point. Let's take a look at what happened with the Rhineland. If you look back at page 76 in your book, which is discussing the Treaty of Versailles provisions, you can see a map at the top of that page. The Rhineland was supposed to be a demilitarized zone in between. It lay within Germany, but it was on the western border of Germany and the eastern border of France. And this was an area that was seen as the French as key to their future security. So any attempts by the German to take any type of military action here would have been seen as a definite sign of aggression. So Hitler, he had to be up until this point in 1936 pretty cautious of what he was doing. Pretty much he was focusing on his own country and getting the people's support rallied behind him. He did start attacking the Treaty of Versailles piece by piece, like with the reparations, the beginning of rearmament within the country. But now at this point he was able to turn his attention outside of Germany's borders and to achieving objectives that he had for the whole of Europe. Because of the fact that the Abyssinian crisis had failed miserably and shown the weakness of the League of Nations, Hitler saw this as the perfect time to pursue these objectives of sending in troops to areas that were strictly forbidden for troops to be in with the Treaty of Versailles, such as the Rhineland. Hitler was convinced that he could get away with rearming the Rhineland because he felt that with the Abyssinian crisis that the French would not take any type of military action because of what had gone down with the Abyssinian crisis. They had been embarrassed. Plus, he knew countries were acting in their own self-interest, as was seen with this Anglo-German naval agreement. So pretty much Hitler decided to send in the amounts of troops that you see here, 10,000 troops and 23,000 armed police into the Rhineland in March of 1936. And you can see in your book, in the top of page 117, there was absolutely no response from the British or the French. The reason there was no response was because inside of France there was a lot of disagreement on exactly how to respond. They were not quite sure if they could mount a successful resistance to Hitler. And with the British, they were pretty much against responding in any type of military fashion. At this point, there was a man named Neville Chamberlain who was in charge of Great Britain, and he was definitely a man that was in favor of appeasement of Hitler and not taking military action in order to avoid war at all costs. Later on, people like Winston Churchill, who was to take over Great Britain during the years of World War II, saw the Rhineland rearmament as a key point, that if Hitler had been stopped at this juncture, because his military was smaller than it grew to be, that this would have pretty much thwarted all of Hitler's plans. It would have exposed some weakness, and that meant that Hitler probably could have been stopped at this point, but he was not, and therefore he continued to pursue his objectives of what he wanted with Europe outside of Germany's borders. So you might be wondering what the whole point of the Germans doing this was, because the Rhineland was an area inside their country. But I think that Hitler was doing it basically to make a statement that he could get away with these types of actions. He could successfully violate the Treaty of Versailles and nobody was going to do anything about it. He was exposing the weaknesses of the Allied countries and the League of Nations, and pretty much sending a message that he was on a mission to achieve his objectives that he had come up with ever since the end of World War I. Pretty much right at around the same time of the rearming of the Rhineland, the Spanish Civil War had been going on, and both Italy and Germany decided to get involved. The two countries had grown closer together with the Abyssinian crisis because Italy was pretty much embarrassed and pushed away from Britain and France, even though they had tried to work with Italy to keep it as an ally against Hitler. It had the opposite effect. So Germany and Italy decided to enter this civil war going on inside of Spain and give support to General Franco's forces. Much more Italian troops were involved than German troops, but pretty much Hitler used this civil war as a way to test out his military strength at that point. He led a very famous bombing at Guernica, which was something mentioned on the very first video I showed you when we started the World War II unit. And you can see a picture of it on page 117. He was testing out the effectiveness of civilian bombing, which was a huge feature of World War II. So pretty much this Spanish Civil War was a testing ground for the Germans, and it showed that countries were deciding to get involved in each other's situations and with more violence and warlike measures. And so the world was leading closer and closer to war. Taking it a step further, after the Spanish Civil War, where Italy and Germany got involved, the two countries then signed an agreement called the Rome-Berlin Axis. It was suggested by Mussolini. Hitler agreed to it, and it's the idea that the European countries would revolve around Italy and Germany. Hitler then took it a step further by initiating this anti-Comintern pact, which was signed with Japan, and then Italy came into the agreement a year later. Pretty much now, if you remember, Comintern from when we discussed the Chinese Civil War was that Soviet organization that was meant to assist communist revolutions in other countries. It stands for Communist International. And pretty much what Hitler was wanting to do was to use Japan as leverage to apply pressure in Asia so that he wouldn't have as much resistance in Europe trying to do what he needed to do. The Japanese could tie up the Russians and get them distracted, and we know that the British had a large navy that had parts of Asia and the Pacific under their control, so he wanted the Japanese as a clear ally so that he could succeed with what he wanted to with Europe. Let's go back to Hitler's maneuvering of the situation inside of Germany with the discussion of the Hossbach Memorandum, which you can see at the top of page 118. It was basically the notes recorded from a meeting that Hitler had on November 5th of 1937, in which he addressed the Reichschancellor in Berlin. In this meeting that he led, he basically outlined his goals of what he wanted to do and what he was already doing at that point, but he clearly defined them again. Some historians believe that Hitler was pretty much trying to root out any type of opposition in his own military of who would oppose his plans, while others feel that this meeting was more important as clear evidence of war planning by Hitler. Pretty much the main objectives that he addressed, you can see on the screen here. He reemphasized the idea of preserving German racial integrity and getting rid of undesirable races. He also felt like the idea of Lebensraum that was mentioned back in Mein Kampf should be continued and enlarged. And probably the most important part of this meeting was the timing. He felt that if the Germans waited too long, that the international situation would not be favorable for Germany to achieve these objectives. He felt like the late 30s would be the time to act, and he encouraged those listening that that's what they needed to do. So if you look above the purple box on 118 and then at the top of 119, there's a general consensus among historians that this Hossbach Memorandum is pretty much evidence of Hitler's war planning because his intentions were explicit and these objectives could not be achieved without war, and he's encouraging the Germans to take the initiative and engage in warlike measures at the end of the 1930s and early 40s and not waiting too long. You can see the view of James Sheehan at the top of 119. He's a famous historian on the World Wars, and he weighs in at the top of 119 with his opinion of this meeting. But pretty much like we've seen, Hitler was definitely set on achieving these objectives, and pretty much to do so required war. After this point, he turned his attention back again to Austria. He had attempted an Anschluss earlier and was unsuccessful, but he decided to try again in March of 1938. So let's take a look at the issue of timing first. He sent in troops in March of 1938 into Austria. 4 years earlier, when he had attempted it the first time, he met resistance. This time he met no resistance, and there are several reasons for that. Italy was now a firm ally, as we've seen with this Rome-Berlin axis and anti-Comintern Pact and what had happened with the Abyssinian crisis. And now in Britain, like I had mentioned before, Neville Chamberlain was now leading the country, and he admitted that the Treaty of Versailles was wrong to demand that Germany and Austria never be allowed to unify again. So pretty much Hitler saw this as his opportunity. The Austrian Chancellor, a man by the name of Kurt von Schuschnigg, said that there needed to be a referendum about the idea of Anschluss because Hitler had tried it 4 years earlier. And Hitler then sent in the troops to quote-unquote monitor the vote to make sure it was conducted peacefully. And you can obviously see the sarcasm with that and the irony, because probably his troops intimidated and bullied people into voting a certain way. So you can see the results, 99.75% voted in favor of unification. So how realistic that vote was is another story, but this benefited Hitler enormously because now he had the Austrian armed forces and natural resources of the country to use. And remember, Hitler was an Austrian himself, and that's where he was from before fighting for the Germans in World War I. After succeeding with the Anschluss of Austria, Hitler then turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, which was one of those new nations created after World War I from the treaty settlements like Versailles. And we remember from the Treaty of Versailles settlement that there were several areas taken from Germany that had German-speaking peoples in them. One of them was the Sudetenland, which was a part of Czechoslovakia but pretty much had a strong German population. And Hitler decided that this would be the area that he wanted to take next. The Czechoslovakian leader was a man by the name of Edvard Beneš, and he knew what Hitler was wanting to do. He asked Britain and France to help them. France had to because they were already under a treaty agreement with Czechoslovakia. Britain reluctantly said that they would support the French, so Beneš thought that he had the support of these two countries. Hitler decided kind of to call their bluff. He said that he would fight for the Sudetenland. It was a very bold threat because, as you can see on 119, the Czechs did have a modernized army and state-of-the-art armaments, and Britain and France had given indications that they would support Beneš if Hitler invaded. So Neville Chamberlain, being the peaceful man that he was the leader of Great Britain at the time, decided to try to meet with Hitler to resolve the situation peacefully. Hitler said that he was was only willing to take part of the Sudetenland and only if the people voted, but then he increased his demand, said that he wanted more. The result of this situation was the Munich Agreement, which pretty much said that Britain and France would cave into Hitler. They would agree to letting him take the Sudetenland. Beneš was never consulted. He was pretty much left holding the bag. And you can see here at the bottom, the significance of this was that Hitler now had called their bluff successfully, and he then took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland. So he was now, knowing that nobody was there to stop him, he could continue with his goals, and the next part would be to invade the country of Poland.